Hello, this is Laps of the Past, an F1 history podcast. In this episode, we are going back to the beginning. I'm your host, Jarmo. Jump in! Welcome back to the Laps of the Past. Today, we are launching a special 3-part mini-series exploring the radical, dangerous and often forgotten era that built the very foundation of Grand Prix racing. You see, from the very moment the automobile was invented, people wanted to know one thing: who was the fastest? When we think of Formula 1 today, we picture pristine asphalt, carbon fiber survival cells, and engineers analyzing gigabytes of data in real time. But the sport we love didn't just appear out of nowhere in 1950. It was born from a time when roads were made of dirt, cars looked like motorized chariots, and drivers wore nothing but leather caps and goggles. This is the story of the wild beginnings, an era of unmatched bravery, engineering madness, and a tragedy that changed motorsport forever. To understand how we got to Formula 1, we have to travel back to the late 19th century. The automobile was a brand new invention back then, and honestly, the world was deeply skeptical. People saw these horseless carriages as loud, unreliable, and frankly dangerous toys for the ultra-wealthy. But the pioneers who built these machines knew something else. They knew that the best way to prove their reliability and actually sell them was to test them in public. But where did the spark for the very first event actually came from? It was all a marketing stunt. The idea came from Pierre Giffard, a forward-thinking and dramatic journalist for the Paris newspaper, Le Petit Journal. Giffard wanted to push the automotive industry out of its infancy, prove the skeptics wrong, and, let's be honest, sell a massive amount of newspapers. So he announced a grand competition and offered a massive prize of 5,000 francs for the vehicle that best demonstrated the future of transport. So, the very first organized motoring event took place in France in 1894, running from Paris to Rouen. Now, it wasn't a race in the modern sense. It was a reliability trial. The goal was just be the fastest, but to demonstrate a vehicle that was safe, easy to handle and cheap to run. The winning speed averaged a staggering 19 km per hour. But as I said, reliability was never going to be enough for long. Within just few years, these trials evolved into flat-out, high-speed races. And because there were no purpose-built racetracks yet, the early pioneers used the only things available: the open public roads connecting the major cities of Europe. By the turn of the century, road racing had absolutely exploded in popularity, and the technology was moving at a terrifying pace. As these races transformed the local trials into massive international spectacles, a new tradition was born: national racing colors. Soon, French cars were racing in blue, Italian cars in red, and British cars in a dark, iconic green. But where did these colors actually came from? They were born back in 1900, thanks to a wealthy American newspaper tycoon named James Gordon Bennett Jr. He created the very first international motorsport tournament, the Gordon Bennett Cup. This wasn't just a race between individual drivers, it was designed as a fierce battle between nations, almost like the Olympics of motorsport. The rules were incredibly strict. Every single part of the car, down to the smallest bolt, spark plug and the tire, had to be manufactured in the country it represented, and the driver had to be a member of that nation's automobile club. To help the spectators distinguish between the moving countries through the blinding dust and mud, each nation was assigned a specific racing color. The races themselves were spectacular, high-stakes events that completely paralyzed the host regions. They weren't run on modern circuits, but across hundreds of kilometers of closed public roads, cutting through open countrysides, dusty villages and mountain passes. Hundreds of thousands of fans lined the tracks, and the drivers had to fight not just each other, but roaming livestock, blinding dust, and constant mechanical failures. It was a brutal test of endurance where surviving the treacherous route was often a victory in itself. And the stories behind these colors assigned to these nations are fascinating. France took blue because it was a traditional color of their military and they were the undisputed kings of early manufacturing. Italy actually started with black, but after an Italian prince won an epic 8,000-mile race from Peking to Paris in a Prix red car in 1907, the nation fell in love with it and adopted Rosso Corsa, racing red, as their own. And British racing green, that was a direct result of the Cup's unique rules. The regulations stated that whichever country won the race had to host the event the following year. In 1902, a British driver won, meaning Great Britain had to host the 1903 Cup. But because the road racing was strictly illegal on the British mainland, they had to move the entire event over to Ireland. As a courtesy and heartfelt thank you to their welcoming Irish host, the British teams painted their cars emerald green, and the colours took forever. In less than a decade, engine sizes ballooned. Manufacturers were building massive heavy cars with engines pushing 10 or 12 liters of capacity, producing nearly 100 horsepower. On narrow, unpaved public roads, these monsters could reach speeds of over 130 km per hour. Driving these cars was a brutal physical ordeal. They had primitive suspension, heavy steering, and wooden spoke wheels wrapped in fragile rubber tires that would puncture constantly. There were no seatbelts, no roll cages, and effectively no brakes. And the drivers didn't go out there alone. Sitting next to the pilot was the riding mechanic. This wasn't a passive passenger seat, the mechanic shop was a matter of life and death. While bouncing violently over potholes, the mechanic had to constantly look backward to check for overtaking cars, manually pump oil and fuel pressure into the engine, and be ready to jump out to change a shredded tire in a matter of seconds. As crowds grew into hundreds of thousands, lining the dirt roads to see these daredevils fly past in blinding clouds of dust, the stage was set for a massive disaster. And in May of 1903, that disaster arrived. By 1903, the city-to-city racing had become a massive international phenomenon. The world had already witnessed successful races connecting Paris to Berlin and Paris to Vienna. But French Automobile Club and the Spanish authorities wanted something even bigger, something more prestigious and far more grueling. They aimed to connect two European capitals across the formidable Pyrenees Mountains. This was the birth of the Paris-Madrid race. It was the very first time such an ambitious route was ever attempted, and it was heavily backed by Spain's car enthusiast king, Alfonso XIII, who was desperate to put his country on the automotive map. For manufacturers, this race was everything. It wasn't just a sporting event, it was a brutal marketing war between French, German and Italian brands. Winning meant national pride and skyrocketing commercial sales. The pressure to win was immense, and no driver wanted to lift their foot off the throttle. The excitement reached an absolute fever pitch. More than 300 drivers registered, and on May 24th, over 200 cars actually lined up to the start in Versailles, surrounded by a chaotic, uncontrolled crowd over 100,000 spectators. But what was supposed to be an ultimate triumph of human engineering turned into a horror story from the very first kilometers. The primary villain of the day was dust. With over 200 cars launching at intervals, the dry, unpaved dirt roads were instantly whipped into thick, blinding clouds of white powder. Drivers couldn't see more than a few meters ahead. They were flying at speeds well over 100 km per hour, completely blind, relying on pure instinct and the frantic hand gestures of their riding mechanics. The combination of zero visibility, massive crowds standing right on the edge of the road, and heavy, unstable machines was catastrophic. Cars drifted off the road, rolled into ditches, and crashed into trees. Spectators, unaware of how fast these monsters were approaching, stepped into the road and were struck. The tragedies mounted rapidly. One of the sport's first true superstars, Marshal Renault, co-founder of the Renault car company, blinded by dust, lost control of his car at high speed, crashed into a ditch and suffered fatal injuries. Both Marshall and his riding mechanic Renaud Vautier suffered horrific injuries, while Vautier survived with severe wounds. Marshall would tragically pass away 2 days later, at the age of just 31. Marshall was far from just a driver, he was a visionary. Together with his brother Louis and Ferdinand, he had founded the Renault company just 4 years earlier in 1899. While Louis was the engineer genius, Marshall was the business mind and the daring racer who proved that what their cars could do on the world stage. Just a year prior, in 1902, Marshall had achieved a legendary status by winning the prestigious Paris-Vienna race. In another horrific incident during that same weekend, a car swerved to avoid a spectator, hit a tree and burst into flames, killing both the driver and the mechanic. By the time the leading cars reached Bordeaux, which was only the end of the first stage, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. At least 8 people were dead and dozens more were severely injured. The French government stepped in immediately. They banned the race from continuing, impounded all the cars, and officially forced the organizers to cancel the remainder of the journey to Madrid. The cars were literally towed by horse to the nearest train station. For the Renault family, the price of this race was too high. Devastated by the loss of his brother, Louis Renault immediately withdrew all his company's factory cars from motorsport and vowed never to sit in a competitive racing cockpit again. The Paris-Madrid disaster was a massive shock to the world, and it marked the beginning of the end for the grand city-to-city road races. Now, to be fair, open road racing didn't vanish overnight. Years later, legendary races like Mille Miglia or Darga Florio in Italy would capture the world's imagination by racing through towns and mountain passes. But after 1903, governments across Europe realized that these fast, heavy monsters could no longer be unleashed on completely open, uncontrolled public roads without serious consequences. The passion for racing hadn't died, it just had to adapt. Since they could no longer simply race from one capital city to another, organizers had to find a new way. The solution was the creation of closed-loop circuits. By closing off specific, manageable network of local roads, or better yet, building purpose-built racing tracks with barriers and grandstands. Organizers could finally control the crowds and provide a safer environment for the drivers. This dramatic shift led directly to a new kind of event. An event where cars would no longer sprint dangerously from city to city, but compete on a defined, regulated, closed circuit for a single grand prize. The blueprint for this new era was drawn in France in 1906 on a closed loop of public roads near a town called Le Mans. They organized the world's very first closed-circuit race on this scale, competing for that ultimate prize. The massive success of this new format changed everything, and just a year later it led directly to the creation of the world's very first permanent, purpose-built racetrack, Brooklands in England in 1907. And Brooklands was an absolute monster of engineering. It was a massive, nearly a 3.5-mile oval circuit, constructed entirely out of concrete, but what made it truly legendary and terrifying were its enormous steep banked corners. These concrete bankings rose nearly 30 feet into the air, designed specifically so that cars could tackle the corners at well over 100 miles per hour without having to lift the throttle. It was a breathtaking spectacle, a colosseum of speed that instantly became the center of British motorsport world. But it was also incredibly brutal. The concrete track was famously bumpy, and driving a heavy, primitive car on those high-speed banks required immense physical strength and nerves of steel. And more importantly, it laid the structural foundation for a new kind of event, a race for a grand prize. In France, they call it a Grand Prix. When we look back at these first 2 decades of motoring history, it's hard not to feel a sense of absolute awe. The men who climbed into those massive, shaking machines weren't just sports heroes. They were astronauts stepping into the unknown. They raced with zero protection, driven by pure passion, adrenaline, and that fundamental human desire to push the limits of speed. Without their wild bravery and without the hard lessons learned from the tragedies of the dusty roads of France, the concept of regulated circuit racing and eventually Formula One might never have been born. They had to run blindly into the dust so that the future generation could race on the pristine tracks we see today. And that brings us to the end of the first part of our mini-series on the roots of Formula One. In the next episode, we are stepping into the 1920s and 30s, the legendary golden age of Grand Prix racing, where beautiful Bugattis and Alfas were suddenly challenged by the terrifying power of Nazi-funded silver arrows. You won't want to miss it. Before I go, I want to turn it over to you. As we build this podcast together, I want to hear your thoughts and ideas. What are the historic races, forgotten drivers, or crazy motorsport stories you would love to hear covered in future episodes? Let me know by dropping an email at lapsofthepast@gmail.com. And make sure to follow us on Instagram or at TikTok at lapsofthepast. If you enjoyed this trip back in time, please follow and subscribe on your favorite platform. Thank you for listening to the Laps of the Past. My name is Jarmo. Until next time, keep looking back.